Bourgeoisie produces, above all, Art Zone. Gravediggers.
Hi.
Hey everyone, guess who's back?
Yay, Amar's back, everyone. Woo.
Yeah, much like the great avant-garde philosopher Slim Shady says, I'm back.
I am Erin.
And it's Amr from Toronto.
And welcome to another episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
And this one is going to boil your blood, so strap on for a ride.
Yeah, we should probably have a content warning. This does include violence against a child, plus alleged war crimes. Alleged. We do try to warn you guys, of course, when a case is especially enraging, and this one is, whew.
Yeah.
But before we even really get started, I just want to acknowledge that the subject of today's case, retired United States Navy SEAL Edward Gallagher, is apparently a very litigious person. A spokesperson for the Gallagher family has claimed that they will sue the New York Times journalist Dave Phillips over his reporting on the case. Of course, we didn't break the story ourselves, and we haven't brought it into newspaper headlines. This case has been in the news for over a year, maybe 2 years, and you've likely heard about it, but maybe don't know the details or the international significance of the trial. So we are relaying and commenting on the facts as they are available to us through sources like Phillips' articles, video footage available on Hulu, and Gallagher's own interviews with Fox News. Eddie Gallagher is a public figure, and he's made himself one through his actions, like continuously appearing on Fox News and shilling workout supplements on Instagram. He has spoken as a guest on other podcasts, although I think it goes without saying he will not appear on Das Criminal.
There's something very hilarious about right-wing grifts, because with liberal grifts, it's very sterile, they try very hard, but with right-wing grifts, it's like this guy has been tried for war crimes, and after all of his reputation is to shill workout supplements and probably fucking snake oil on Instagram.
I gave it a look, and there's also a lot of t-shirts and keychains and things like that are like Murica.
All of them are like that. Like that guy who killed Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. Wasn't his shtick is to sell t-shirts now? Like he was selling t-shirts and stuff?
I think so. There's a lot of anti-Colin Kaepernick t-shirts and stuff where you're like, wow, this is what you do now. Okay.
Yeah, but it's fascinating because on a material level, conservatives currently hold all the levers of power. They control the Senate, they have the judiciary, and they have the presidency. And yet somehow they still get angry because some football player refuses to prostrate themselves to their liking enough. They're so obsessed with winning with a culture war.
Yeah, it's also these people being like, I didn't fight in Iraq so you could kneel for our flag. And it's like, no, you fight for the interests of big oil. That's even sadder.
Yeah, but even if we take their claims at face value, you're over there fighting for freedom, well, technically freedom should include freedom to not stand for the flag or whatever. But yeah, therein lies the hypocrisy of the right, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let's get started. Our story begins on May 4th, 2017, in western Mosul, northern Iraq. The city was embroiled in a fierce battle between the so-called Islamic State and the Iraqi army, supported in different ways and to various degrees by the Kurds, Iran, Hezbollah, Pakistan, and a joint task force led by the United States. At this point, Mosul's people had suffered under ISIS for nearly 3 years, with ethnic and religious minorities bearing the worst of it. We could talk about the horrors of ISIS all day, but we're going to assume that our listeners don't need a refresher. The Iraqi security forces had secured most of eastern Mosul, but the city's western part was still a battleground. It was a bloody battle and especially dangerous for civilians. For instance, in March 2017, the U.S. Air Force bombed the El Aghawat al Jadida neighborhood in western Mosul, killing hundreds of civilians. While the Pentagon claimed those casualties were accidental, as it always does, the Iraqi parliament and international observers like Amnesty, the UN, and Human Rights Watch expressed concern over the high civilian death toll. Remember going into this case that often people killed during war, particularly by long-range weapons like bombs, missiles, and snipers, never have the opportunity to defend themselves as civilians or non-combatants. People in the wrong place at the wrong time, especially those of a particular demographic, like fighting-age males, can be killed and then posthumously marked as militants. They aren't afforded trials or inquiries into their actions.
Yeah, it's actually quite depressing. I was reading Patrick Coburn's latest book, War in the Age of Trump, which I do recommend, by the way. And during the siege of Mosul, he managed to reach the government-controlled east side and then use satellite phones to contact his sources on the west side, who were under Islamic State control. And so, like, during the battle, he would lose contact with more and more of them. And after the battle, he discovered that by the end, literally none of his contacts survived. And from what he gathered, they either died under rubble from artillery and airstrikes by the coalition, or the inverse, being shot by snipers, like Islamic State snipers, attempting to flee to the west side of the city. And pretty much, he says in the book, they had no hope. They would die if they stayed, and they would die if they tried to flee.
Yeah, I don't think we can overemphasize for civilians just how awful and terrifying this was and how many of them died.
Yeah.
This is the case throughout the U.S. occupation of Iraq. American soldiers shoot an Iraqi and claim that the person was a militant, but the person's family, neighbors, etc. insist that they weren't a fighter. The nature of occupation puts a target on everybody's back, and occupying soldiers are rarely held accountable for, quote-unquote, mistakenly killing civilians. Of course, war is a horrific thing, and that's why there are rules in place intended to limit its devastation. Don't target civilians, don't torture people, don't take hostages, don't use child soldiers. We have heard of these, but we also know that laws are rarely applied symmetrically.
Yeah, I mean, for a case in point, see Omar Khadr. By all accounts, a child soldier when he was captured, and yet treated by the US and Canada as an enemy combatant just because at the time it was more expedient to do so.
And like powerful individuals, powerful countries are much less likely to face consequences for violating international law. Furthermore, they often conduct potentially illegal activities within a dubious gray area. By muddying the waters concerning who constitutes a civilian versus a combatant, or what meets the definition of torture, militaries avoid accountability for schemes which might seem to the rest of us like clear-cut breaches of the rules of engagement. So, in the spring of 2017, a coalition of armed forces worked together to drive ISIS out of western Mosul. During the battle, they bombed a house, and in that house, they assert, were several ISIS fighters. Only one occupant survived the bombing, a teenage boy who has not been named as far as I've been able to find. He was wounded and taken as a prisoner by the coalition forces. A call went out over the radio saying the coalition forces had captured a suspected ISIS fighter at the bombing site. At that point, according to his subordinates, Chief Petty Officer Edward Gallagher of SEAL Team 7 responded to the radio message something along the lines of, "Don't touch him, he's mine." Gallagher arrived on the scene within minutes, where the teenage boy laid on the ground with coalition soldiers surrounding him.
Yeah, if there's any clearer distinction between what premeditated first-degree murder and manslaughter would look like, this is pretty much it. Not that, like, I consider law to be the end-all of morality, but if anything describes a predicated killing of a boy, this is it, and it's fucking sickening.
Then, as stated by the other SEALs in Gallagher's platoon, the chief knelt beside the wounded captive and, without saying a word, stabbed him multiple times in the neck. After, Gallagher posed for several trophy photos with the corpse, holding up the deceased boy's head by his hair. These photos are on the internet and they're easy to find, but I wouldn't recommend searching for them. They're really horrific, and nobody needs the image of soldiers gloating over a dead child in their head. So who is Eddie Gallagher? In 2017, he was a career soldier and a highly decorated one at that. This tour in Iraq was his 8th deployment, and he was a leader of a 16-man platoon in SEAL Team 7. According to those soldiers, Gallagher was, quote, evil, toxic, and perfectly okay with killing anybody that was moving, end quote. Dave Phillips of the New York Times has written extensively about this case, and he reports that Gallagher's subordinates saw Gallagher commit other unlawful killings during the Battle of Mosul. They insist that Gallagher shot indiscriminately into crowds and picked off people from his sniper's nest for no reason. In footage obtained by the New York Times and published in part on Hulu, other snipers tell investigators they would regularly fire warning shots to alert civilians to flee the area before Gallagher could start shooting.
So when is Clint Eastwood going to make a movie glorifying this bloodless psychopath? Just wondering.
Yeah, it's very wannabe Chris Kyle.
Yeah, pretty much.
On one occasion, Gallagher's colleagues report that he shot a girl in a flower print hijab who was walking with her friends along the river, probably the Tigris which runs through Mosul. She fell to the ground and her friends dragged her away. Another time, Gallagher's platoon alleges he shot an older man in the back while the man carried a water jug. It doesn't seem like these people were ever identified, and the cases weren't brought to a trial or tribunal of any sort. But if these allegations are true, they speak to a disturbing pattern with Eddie Gallagher. Before his deployment to Iraq, Gallagher bought a hatchet and a hunting knife handmade by a former Navy SEAL named Andrew Arabito. Journalist Matthew Cole wrote an excellent piece for The Intercept called The Crimes of SEAL Team 6, where he describes the gruesome significance of the hatchet in SEAL culture. The article was released in January 2017, before the Gallagher incident even happened. But a former SEAL tells Cole, quote, "They have the hatchets to flaunt the law. Our job is to ensure that we conduct ourselves in a way befitting the American people and the American flag. The hatchet says we don't care about the Geneva Conventions and that we are above the law and can do whatever we want," end quote. Weirdly prescient, Shortly after his deployment, Gallagher texted Arabito, quote, "I'll try and dig that knife or hatchet on someone's skull," end quote. Gallagher later texted one of the photos he took beside the captive's body to another former SEAL with the caption, quote, "I got him with my hunting knife," end quote.
This is a good place, I think, to mention that the US currently has an act called the American Service Members Protection Act, which I'm going to refer to as the ASMP Act from here. And it was enacted in 2002, and it stipulates that the US retains the right to use, quote, "all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of any US or allied personnel being detained or imprisoned by, on behalf of, or at the request of the International Criminal Court," end quote. In other words, the US pretty much provisions under this act, enacted by Bush, by the way, and retained by Obama, that if the International Criminal Court in The Hague detains a US military member, then the US can practically invade The Hague. And not only invading The Hague, but if another country detains a US military member for war crimes and tries to send them to The Hague, like, I don't know, whatever country, Thailand or whatever, then the US has the right to invade that country as well.
Damn.
So I guess, I don't know, my advice to all you would-be countries is please don't detain an American, apparently.
Yeah, they will also fight to release their soldiers, like that guy, I think he was a Marine, maybe Army, who killed a young trans woman named Jennifer Lottie in the Philippines. The US fought to get him out of the Philippines.
Yeah, I think they succeeded too, yeah.
Yeah, I think he's in Hawaii or Guam or something now. Absolutely ridiculous. Now, I think we have to talk about how, if this is true, like we've said, it constitutes a war crime. I guess some people just believe that war is a bloody business and killing your enemies without reservations is fair, but it's not. There are rules, and they are mostly there to protect vulnerable people like children from violence and cruelty. We often think of the rules of engagement as a modern invention of war, but this really isn't the case. There are literally biblical records of commanders instructing their soldiers to show mercy to their enemies and give them a chance to surrender. Knights in the Middle Ages were supposed to conduct themselves under a code of chivalry.
The code of chivalry used by knights does have its limitations, I guess. And that was limited to other knights or nobles because knights, for example, must show a level of mercy to other nobles. And if they capture them, they have to give them a chance for ransom. But then those rights never really extended to the peasantry, which is why knights often relied on methods like the chevauchés during the Hundred Years' War. And it's really interesting as well. The Quran, for example, laid out rules of war for the early Islamic Ummah in Medina. And those rules of war were followed to an extent under Muhammad, but it seems that after his death, these rules were very easily bent with some vague justification.
Yeah, and this seems like as good a time as ever to plug Amar's Radio War Nerd episode. If you are interested in the politics of pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islam, that's the place to go.
Yeah, give those guys a good listen. I really recommend Radio Warner. They're good people over there.
Of course, we can have endless ethical debates about what the rules of engagement should be, but the assertion that war crimes are a new concept or a United Nations concoction intended to weaken militaries is just wrong. The Third Geneva Convention outlines the treatment of prisoners and specifies that they must be protected and given medical treatment if necessary. Now, arrests and prosecutions for war crimes are complex topics of legal scholarship and international relations that we will discuss throughout this entire podcast and probably on our next episode as well. But it's important to note that almost the whole world agrees that prisoners of war should not be killed. Regarding this specific case, I have some immediate questions that I haven't seen answered by other media outlets. First, how do we know for sure that the teenage boy was an ISIS fighter? It's the coalition's word against his, and he's dead along with everyone else in that house. I haven't found any source that disputes that he was affiliated with ISIS, but I doubt we will ever really know the extent of his involvement. A video released by the New York Times shows the teenager lying on the ground while soldiers shout at him in different languages. He's disoriented, maybe suffered a concussion or something in the bombing, and he tells one person in Arabic that his father told him, quote, not to join them, end quote. I assume them, in this case, means the Islamic State, so I suppose that is taken as a confession. I still think, though, if we are going to take all these precautions to note that Eddie Gallagher is an alleged criminal or an accused criminal, we have to show the same scrutiny for this teenage boy. Don't forget, 6 weeks before this incident, the US Air Force had bombed hundreds of Iraqi civilians and erroneously claimed they were ISIS militants. We should be very wary of accepting that this character was an ISIS fighter on the word of the people who blew up the house. One article by Phillips says the boy was between 12 and 17 years old. In that case, we are talking about the death of a child soldier. Indeed, I think ISIS is despicable, and any person who willingly enlists is also contemptible. But I believe, especially in the case of children, that re-education is possible. That doesn't mean people shouldn't be held accountable for the crimes they've committed. But a teenager indoctrinated into violent Islamism deserves a chance to atone, as do teenagers pulled into cults or gangs.
It is also possible, by the way, that ISIS press ganged this child to join their army under threat of his death or the death of his family. On a wild tangent, in the beginning of the movie Saving Private Ryan, the American troops shoot what appears to be two Wehrmacht soldiers who are begging and pleading in what initially appears to be German, But if you turn on the subtitles, it's revealed that they're begging and pleading in Czech, and that what they're trying to say is that they were captured by the Nazis and forced to fight. And I only describe this scene because it's entirely feasible that this child, even if he was an ISIS fighter, was forced to fight, like many child soldiers in many scenarios.
In this specific case, too, we don't even know who this boy was or what he did. Did he shoot at people? Kill people? Was he involved in sexual violence and human trafficking like many ISIS fighters are? Was he just in a supporting role, as so many enablers of atrocities have argued? In any of these circumstances, he should be held accountable for what he did, but I don't think we'll ever really know those details because he's dead. I think we should all be suspicious of one body like the Navy SEALs playing judge, jury, and executioner. And we definitely can't allow soldiers to kill people and then say, oh, they were terrorists. That sets a very dangerous precedent. And, as we will later examine, someone in this case is lying about what happened. Maybe it's Gallagher, or perhaps it's the other SEALs. But in any circumstance, why should we believe they're all telling the truth about whether the targeted house was definitely an ISIS lair? It's not as if they found Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in there. There are also questions about the extent of the boy's wounds before he was killed. In one article, Phillips writes that the captive had been wounded in the leg, and elaborates, quote, a video clip shows the youth struggling to speak, but SEAL medics told investigators that his wounds had not appeared life-threatening, end quote. A later article states that the teenager had a collapsed lung, and that SEAL medics were cutting a hole in his side to insert a tube when Gallagher approached and stabbed the captive. These details will become very important when we discuss Gallagher's trial. According to the other SEALs in Gallagher's platoon, the stabbing of the teenage prisoner was the last straw. They held a meeting and decided to report Gallagher's conduct to the higher-ups. At first, however, the SEAL leaders back in San Diego were unreceptive to accusations against Gallagher. They warned the platoon that turning in their leader could devastate their careers, and word got back to Gallagher that his subordinates had sounded the alarm.
Okay, I'm really curious here. If this is the straw that broke the camel's back, I wonder what things other SEAL members did that is considered normal or not complaint-worthy.
Right, like the Intercept article about the hatchet culture, that the entire point of it is being brutal toward the people whose countries you occupy.
Pretty much, yeah. It's like, it seems not just like that Gallagher is separate, but that this is part and parcel of what SEALs are supposed to do in other countries.
Yeah, and that they say he used to snipe people from his sniper's nest like a little girl and an old man. Okay, and you didn't follow up on those? There's photographic evidence of this, so maybe that's why they figured we can definitely do something about this, but like, how many basically nameless, faceless Afghans and Iraqis have to die before someone does something? This guy's a serial killer.
Yeah, and they're all aiding and abetting it, at the very least.
The Navy Times reports, quote, Gallagher attempted to cover up these alleged crimes by threatening to murder witnesses and embarking on a campaign to identify other whistleblowers, get them blacklisted in the special warfare community, and ruin their careers, end quote. Yeah, and I'd say the special warfare community is definitely one where you don't want to be blacklisted.
Yeah, the real VIP area.
I just mean I don't want an actual serial killer to have me on his naughty list, for sure.
Oh, absolutely not, yeah.
Although here we are making a podcast about it, but I don't think he can get into the country where I am, so.
Well, I hope not.
But the platoon didn't stop pushing. It took nearly a year, but finally, NCIS took the case. In September 2018, Eddie Gallagher was arrested on several charges, including murder and attempted murder. Because he had threatened the SEALs who witnessed the alleged crime, he was thrown in the brig to await trial. In the meantime, Edward Gallagher became a cause célèbre for conservative hawks. His family managed to capture the attention of Fox and Friends. They regularly appeared on the show to complain about Gallagher's conditions in prison. Which is like, don't all the conservatives suddenly become prison abolitionists once their guy gets thrown in prison?
Oh, absolutely. Once like their cousin or whatever gets thrown in prison, even if it's like for something as asinine as like not even embezzlement, something dumb like a ticket, and they sit there for 6 months, suddenly they talk as if they're Marianne Kaba.
Of course, Fox and Friends is President Donald Trump's favorite show, and the commander-in-chief himself began publicly supporting Gallagher, much to the Navy's chagrin. Interestingly, the last time a president intervened in a prison condition matter was President Nixon on behalf of William Calley, the man convicted of perpetrating the My Lai massacre. Other notable Gallagher supporters include former Navy SEAL Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas and Representative Duncan D. Hunter of California, who said that he too had posed with dead bodies for photos while serving as a U.S. Marine, as if that somehow makes it okay.
So I don't understand. If he's confessed, why can't we just throw him in the brig with Eddie?
It's so normalized among these people. Hunter has since resigned from Congress after pleading guilty to misusing campaign funds following a scandal that involved him spending money on extramarital affairs with 5 different women. If I were Eddie Gallagher, I'd probably be like, thanks, but I don't need your help. Gallagher's lawyers also accused the prosecution of spying on them through an emailed web beacon. The judge ordered that the chief prosecutor, Commander Christopher Saplack, be removed from the case, and the proceedings were delayed. This is another instance of the prosecution throwing a case where the defendant is a soldier or police officer. I know we really get our tinfoil hats on about this all the time on the podcast, but like really start.
There is a pattern here. There is definitely a pattern here. It's obvious, at least to me.
Whenever the defendant really is a soldier, a police officer, suddenly the prosecution just like fucks up in such obvious ways.
Yeah, the most basic, like, an amateur lawyer would know that not to do that.
And meanwhile, Eddie Gallagher was released from prison to await trial on these 7 different charges. In June 2019, Edward Gallagher's trial began. He sat before a jury of enlisted military personnel and a Navy judge. The prosecution laid out their evidence. Gallagher sent a text before the killing saying he would, quote, dig that knife or hatchet on someone's skull, end quote. Other Navy SEALs had told investigators they saw Gallagher stab the knife into the unarmed captive's neck. Gallagher posed with the corpse for photos. He then sent those photos to other ex-SEALs with the caption, quote, got him with my hunting knife, end quote. It seems to me like an open and shut case, but what happened next is the stuff of primetime procedural dramas. After several SEALs testified that they saw Eddie Gallagher stab the prisoner in the neck, killing him, the defense called Corey Scott, the medic at the scene, to the stand. The lawyers asked Scott if he had witnessed Gallagher stab the captive, and Scott said yes. Then the lawyers asked Scott if this stabbing had killed the captive, and Scott said no. The defense pressed on. How did the medic know that Gallagher hadn't killed the teenager? Corey Scott said that he himself had killed the captive by blocking his breathing tube until he suffocated. The prosecution's case against Gallagher was falling apart. They had granted Scott immunity in exchange for his testimony against Gallagher, assuming his story on the stand would match the one he told Navy investigators. Gallagher had killed the captive.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, so take my word with a grain of salt, but I'm convinced at this point that the prosecution is trying its best to pretty much throw the trial, because no prosecutor could be this idiotic, and any immunity deal would at least have to include, I think it would have to include a signed written statement from the person they're giving immunity to, in this case, the medic, Scott, that they can then use as a counterweight, showing the statement being like, well, see, you signed this piece of paper with your statement. Am I wrong in that? I don't know. I'm not. That's what I understand from law.
I think immunity means you cannot be prosecuted for what you say, and you can also plead the Fifth Amendment, which means you will not implicate yourself in any crimes. So if I was supposed to testify about someone else and they asked me what I was doing at the time of the murder or whatever, and I was doing something illegal, but I wasn't doing the murder, or I suppose even if I was, I would just plead the Fifth.
Right, but he completely threw their testimony, so surely they had a signed document countering his claims on the stand. I don't know.
Well, they had, I'm sure, what's called his depositions, which is when they tape.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
But he countered his own deposition.
But can't they use a deposition to show that, like, well, if he's lying now, then, this other guy is guilty because the deposition shows that he killed the kid?
Well, yeah, a good attorney will say that's not what you said in your deposition, except they usually have to frame it as a question. So they'll be like, is that the same as what you said in your deposition? But keep in mind as well, the judge and jury are all other Navy people.
Yeah, military, yeah.
And interestingly, Corey Scott's testimony was the only day that Eddie Gallagher's children were in the courtroom. So Phillips of the New York Times seems to think that this is some sort of conspiracy where Gallagher's team was well aware that Scott was going to tell the jury he was responsible for the murder in question. So Corey Scott says he smothered the boy in an act of mercy, fearing that the boy would be tortured if turned over to the Iraqi forces.
Ah, yes, because when people think of Navy SEALs, the first thing I think of is mercy and, generosity.
Right. And also, I murdered this boy so he wouldn't be murdered. You're welcome. This boy, maybe he was an ISIS fighter, like we said. I have seen no evidence disputing that he was. I just haven't seen very convincing evidence either. But he is a nameless child. We don't even know exactly how old he is. He looked like he was maybe 15 to me.
Yeah, he's still a POW. He still deserves the right to a trial and so on and so forth.
But at this point, the murder case against Gallagher is, at least in this courtroom, out the window. Somebody else has confessed on the stand to killing the captive, but he also admitted that he saw Gallagher stab the teenager. The jury came back, though, with only one conviction of the 7 charges for posing with a dead body. Edward Gallagher was sentenced to time served and a demotion in rank. Honestly, I don't understand how he wasn't at least convicted for the stabbing, because even the guy who took the fall said he saw Gallagher stab the boy in the neck.
Exactly. Even if he didn't fucking kill him, surely he could be charged with attempted murder, not to mention causing grievous bodily harm, etc., etc. I feel like in this case, it's not like the tortured conscript from Vietnam. This is like an active sociopath mindset. This person strikes me as the kind of guy who would get drunk in a bar and then make up stories of things he's done. Not even just the things he's done, but exaggerate. Like Chris Kyle, like how Chris Kyle used to lie about things.
Right. And I'm also listening to the last podcast on the left series on Arthur Shawcross right now, who was a serial killer in upstate New York. And he was in Vietnam, and he also went back to the US and made up stories about war crimes he had done when he hadn't done any of these things. But what kind of despicable person do you have to be to say that? So, depending on which witnesses you believe, you might think that Eddie Gallagher literally got away with murder. The case drew considerable attention toward the United States' involvement in Iraq and the military disciplinary process. Much of this attention was critical. The Navy Secretary at the time, Richard Spencer, and no, not that Richard Spencer, wanted to see to it that Gallagher was punished for his conviction by, quote, revoking his trident. End quote. This would be a symbolic defeat for Gallagher, who would not leave the armed forces with the honor of being a SEAL. But Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump intervened. He tweeted that the Navy would not be demoting Gallagher and that the soldier would retire with full honors. The interference angered Spencer, who believed Trump was overstepping his boundaries by directly involving himself in the case. At the same time, Spencer tried to privately make a deal with the White House, allowing Gallagher to keep his trident so long as the president quit publicly interfering in naval affairs. When Defense Secretary Mark Esper learned about this secret deal, he fired Spencer for going outside the chain of command. The next day, Esper announced that Trump had decided Gallagher will keep his pin and retire with full honors. Edward Gallagher ended up retiring as a Navy SEAL, as though nothing sinister had ever happened in Iraq.
It's funny how Trump basically involved himself in this case because Gallagher's family were on Fox and Friends 24/7. Like, he would have never been aware of this case if they weren't on TV because that's the only input he gets is watching Fox and Friends.
Yeah, but Gallagher also became a real cause celeb for the right.
Yeah, I can imagine.
In addition to promoting Gallagher, Trump granted clemency to 2 other U.S. soldiers accused of war crimes. The first, Lieutenant Clint Lawrence, had been convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder for ordering his soldiers to fire on 3 men in Afghanistan in 2008. The second, Major Matthew Goldstein, had not yet stood trial on charges that he killed a suspected terrorist bomb maker in Afghanistan in 2010. These days, Eddie Gallagher shills t-shirts and workout supplements on Instagram. He also appears on right-wing television programs and podcasts, defending his innocence and calling the other SEALs who accused him of murdering an Iraqi boy cowards. Gallagher insists the allegations were actually part of a mutiny, and that his platoon lashed out at him because he pushed them hard.
The victimization complex on the right is truly something to behold.
Yeah, he said too that they manufactured this vast conspiracy because he was a tough boss on them. And it's like, oh, Eddie, they made you take a picture with a teenage boy's corpse. They did that.
Yeah, or text people before you went that you want to bury your knife in someone's skull.
Right, or make a call on the radio that even all the Iraqis heard saying, don't touch him, he's mine.
Yeah.
We have to situate this case within the broader context of U.S. imperialism. In my opinion, the Gallagher case is firmly rooted in the narrative of United States exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. is somehow more just or more moral than other countries. Even setting the murder allegations aside, it should be clear to us that Gallagher broke the rules of war when he posed for a photo with a slain teenager. There are people, like Donald Trump and many of his voting base, who support Gallagher in the sense that they believe he should not be punished for that. Rather than arguing that he didn't do it, some have argued that even if he played judge, jury, and executioner for that teenager, it's okay because killing terrorists is his job. I want to read a quote from Roberto Servent and Danny Haifong's American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. Quote, American exceptionalism claims that the police and the U.S. military alike protect and serve Americans to mask the terror they inflict on humanity. American innocence claims that the military and the police provide freedom for all rather than strip a large section of the population of its freedom to live and determine its own destiny. The commonalities between the military and police as institutions of mass death become erased and replaced by the perception that they represent the pinnacle of an exceptional nation's sacrifice for the betterment of humanity. The ideology of innocence also frames incidents like the My Lai massacre as the U.S. military going off script, when in fact it is no deviation at all from the script of U.S. militarism, end quote. So I think that summarizes quite nicely what we are talking about when we say the alleged war crimes of Eddie Gallagher. Yes, you have him acquitted of these things, but they cannot be removed from the entire system of U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully, you have found our retelling and analysis quite interesting. If you did, you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. You can also become a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/DasCriminal. We always put that link in the description. You can get all sorts of benefits, like a shout out on the show. And we have 2 of those to do right now. So shout outs to Magnus Bernhardsen and Kyle Riedman. Sorry if I mispronounce either of your names, but thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. It really means a lot.
Yeah, welcome to the cult. We really appreciate it.
For you all, we will have access to exclusive Patreon polls and fan requests, plus bonus content. So this Wednesday, we are doing a book review. Next week, because it is the first Wednesday of the month, we have a full-length bonus episode. Plus, you get that warm, fuzzy feeling of supporting us because it does cost money to purchase our equipment, our hosting fees, things like that. So thank you guys so much. You can also follow our socials at Das Criminal Pod. We post photos on Instagram about the cases. Don't worry, we're not going to post the trophy photos. Those are disgusting. Don't worry about that. And please rate us 5 stars and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show's visibility. And tell your friends.
Yeah, tell everyone. Tell your friends, your family, your religious congregation, etc., etc. Until next time, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.